What if independence wasn't truly freedom? I mean, what if the flags changed, but the invisible chains remained? Maybe even got tighter, but in new, more insidious ways. That's the really compelling and I think profoundly relevant question right at the heart of our deep dive today. We're stepping into the world of Kwame Nkrumah's powerful and incredibly provocative book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Now, this isn't just some dusty historical text, though it's definitely important history. It's more like a foundational framework, really, for understanding how power, economics, and politics still shape our world. Right now, today, down to the headlines you read, the stuff you buy. You, our curious learner, brought us this critical book, and well, our mission here is to unpack its core arguments, make them clear, digestible, and we believe incredibly relevant for your own insights into how the world works. We'll look at the maybe surprising connections Nkrumah draws and the pretty profound implications of his analysis. So we'll start by exploring exactly how Nkrumah defines this thing called neo-colonialism, why he calls it the last stage of imperialism, and crucially, its most dangerous form. Then we'll sort of peel back the layers on its methods, the insidious ways it works, revealing how external powers exert control that goes way beyond just military might. From there, we'll plunge into the powerful financial forces that, well, according to Nkrumah, really drive this system. We'll trace the evolution of monopoly capitalism and the rise of U.S. financial power. And finally, we'll look at the broader political, cultural, and ideological stuff Nkrumah identified before considering his proposed path forward, African unity.
Indeed. And the essence, as Nkrumah really describes it, is that a state is theoretically independent. It has all the outward signs, the trappings of international sovereignty. Yet, its economic system, and because of that its political policy, is in reality directed from outside. It's a concept that, honestly, it transforms how you look at global relations. It shifts the focus from, obvious political control to the more subtle but maybe even more pervasive influence of economic levers. We'll definitely examine exactly how Nkrumah backs up these claims with specific examples and figures he presents.
Okay, so let's start right there, unmasking what Nkrumah precisely means by this last stage of imperialism. We're all kind of familiar with old school colonialism, right? That era of direct rule, imperial flags flying, administrators from Europe governing huge territories. But Nkrumah argues that this old form, while it left a huge legacy, of course, it was already kind of on the way out by the mid-20th century. He specifically says it just wasn't politically feasible anymore to turn a nominally independent country back into a direct colony, not like, say, Egypt back in the 19th century where that sort of thing could happen. Once independence was declared, even if it was just nominal, that particular door was, well, mostly closed.
That's a really crucial distinction he makes. Nkrumah's analysis highlights that traditional colonialism, even though it still caused problems in some parts of Africa when he was writing, was everywhere on the retreat. He frames this shift not as, like, the end of imperialism, but as an evolution, a strategic change. In place of colonialism as the main instrument of imperialism, he says, we have today neo-colonialism. And that isn't just playing with words. It signifies a really fundamental adaptation by imperialist powers, a way to keep influence without the obvious costs and direct headaches of running a colony.
And this strategic evolution leads straight to what he calls, quite vividly, the illusion of independence. So picture a newly independent nation. It's got its own flag, bright and new, its own anthem, a seat at the UN, its own government, elections, the whole deal. On the surface, it looks like a fully sovereign country, right, playing on the world stage. But Nkrumah's core definition just cuts right through that carefully built appearance. He says, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. So the appearance of self-rule is kept up very meticulously, while true self-determination, the actual ability to decide your own economic and political path, is basically denied.
Right. And what's particularly sharp in Nkrumah's argument is how he focuses on the psychological side of it, even the language used. He points out that the term decolonization was much and unctuously used by imperialist spokesmen, as he puts it, to describe the transfer of political control. But for Nkrumah, this term deliberately hides what's really going on underneath. He argues that the motive spring of colonialism, however, still controls the sovereignty, meaning the economic control, the basic reason for colonial exploitation in the first place, that stays intact. The relationship fundamentally just changes this outfit. The young, newly independent countries, they keep providing raw materials, primary products, while the older industrialized nations keep providing the manufactured goods. It's a continuation, really, of economic exploitation, just wearing a new politically independent mask.
So why does Nkrumah call this the worst form of imperialism? Why worse? Because, he argues, it gives power without responsibility to those external forces. I mean, think about it. Back in the days of direct colonialism, the imperial power, maybe reluctantly, still had to kind of explain or justify what it was doing back home to its own people. And the people serving the empire and the colony, the local administrators, the soldiers, they could at least look to the formal protection of the imperial state, theoretically. With neo-colonialism, Nkrumah says neither of those things really apply. There's no formal accountability back home for the exploitation that's still happening. And there's no clear formal protection for people inside the neo-colonial state who might be working with those outside interests. It allows for a more distant, more abstract kind of domination. Harder to pin down, harder to fight.
Exactly. And to build on that, Nkrumah suggests that neo-colonialism, just like colonialism before it, postpones the facing of the social issues in the developed world. Issues that, he thinks, will have to be faced before the danger of world war can be eliminated or the problem of world poverty resolved. Essentially, it works as a way for developed capitalist countries to export their own internal social and economic problems. The proof of this policy's success, he argues, is painfully obvious in the ever-widening gap between the richer and the poorer nations of the world. This structure lets external powers keep taking resources and cheap labor without the direct costs of administration, or frankly, the moral pressure to actually develop the regions they exploit. It turns what might be internal class conflict in developed nations into a global conflict between rich and poor countries.
That paints a really striking picture. It's like if old-fashioned colonialism was like having a landlord living right there in your house, bossing you around constantly. Then neo-colonialism, the way Nkrumah describes it, is like having a landlord who lives miles away, maybe even on another continent. But they still subtly control your heating, tell you where you have to buy your food, maybe even influence your job choices, all while insisting very earnestly, oh no, you're completely free, you're in charge. It's subtle, yeah, but its power is immense, affecting pretty much every part of a nation's life.
That analogy really captures the insidious nature of this control he's describing. Nkrumah is clear that while the main powers doing this are often the former colonial rulers, he mentions France specifically and its former territories, it's not always the case. Control can shift almost seamlessly to a new rising power. He gives the example of South Vietnam moving from French influence to United States influence after the French left. And maybe most interestingly, and perhaps the most complex situation, Nkrumah highlights that control may be exercised by a consortium of financial interests which are not specifically identifiable with any particular state. He uses the control of the Congo by great international financial concerns as a key example. This suggests a move away from direct state control towards a more diffused, corporate-driven kind of global power. This web of influence is a theme he keeps coming back to.
Okay, so how do these outside forces actually do this? How do they exert this kind of subtle, nuanced control? It's clearly more complicated than just, sending in the army, although, as we'll get to, military stuff isn't completely off the table either. Nkrumah lays out several key ways this external direction happens, starting with economic and monetary control, which he argues is really the foundation. He explains how a neocolonial state might find itself basically obliged to take the manufactured products of the imperialist power to the exclusion of competing products from elsewhere, unquote. This effectively locks them into being a captive market, making sure profits keep flowing back to the former colonial power or whichever economy is dominant.
Right. And Nkrumah digs deeper into this economic dependency. He points out how control over government policy may be secured by payments towards the cost of running the state, or by the provision of civil servants in positions where they can dictate policy, and crucially, by monetary control over foreign exchange through a banking system controlled by the imperial power. He gives a really striking example of French aid to his former African colonies. On the surface, it looked generous, right? But this aid often had major strings attached. It forced these countries to buy uncompetitive French goods and heavily restricted their trade with anyone outside the French currency zone. This effectively made inter-African trade impossible for a time, guaranteeing huge markets for French exports. These former French territories, Nkrumah points out, were sometimes even forced to accept French aid just to meet their recurrent expenses. Think about that irony: aid that actually functions to keep them financially dependent, ensuring French companies and individuals kept benefiting, even if the French state wasn't directly profiting from the aid itself.
Wow, that's That's quite a setup. An entire economic system built around dependency. It's almost like the powerful outsiders are saying, okay, here's your independence certificate, but only if you keep buying our stuff, use our banks, and, oh, let us pay for your police and some key government jobs.
Hmm.
But it's a remarkably clever, systemic way to keep things running their way, isn't it? But beyond these economic tricks, Nkrumah also talks about the role of military presence and military aid.
Yeah, and this gets to a really important question Nkrumah addresses. Why would these supposedly independent states agree to deals that seem so obviously bad for them? He explains that these states are often deliberately set up as small, non-viable states, basically incapable of developing independently. This forces them to rely on the former colonial power for defense, sometimes even for basic internal security. Their hesitation to cut the cord, he says, is often encouraged by what he calls the sugared water of aid that acts like a stopgap between avid hunger and the hoped-for greater nourishment that never comes. In the most extreme cases, in the Nkrumah notes, imperial troops might actually stay and garrison the neo-colonial state, like what happened initially in the Congo during its early independence struggles, explicitly to protect outside economic interests. But interestingly, Nkrumah sees foreign military bases often justified as needed for security or to prevent balkanization, states breaking apart, as actually a bad strategy for the imperial powers in the long run. He argues quite strongly that the presence of foreign bases arouses popular hostility, more quickly and more surely than does anything else. He says throughout Africa these bases are disappearing. He mentions the withdrawal of bases from Libya as proof that this policy eventually fails because people resist it. And furthermore, Nkrumah suggests that military aid often represents the last stage of neo-colonialism. The money supplied is only for military stuff, and it frequently leads to self-destructive results. He warns that these weapons can end up passing to opponents of the neo-colonial regime, which just fuels the very misery and unrest that caused the instability in the first place. It traps the country in this horrible cycle of conflict and dependence.
Okay, this detailed look at the methods brings us right to the core of Nkrumah's argument, the massive economic engine driving this whole system. And he carefully places this within the history of what he calls monopoly capitalism. He draws a lot on Vladimir Lenin's analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. For us, the listeners, this means understanding the sort of historical and economic background that Nkrumah believed led to neo-colonialism.
Right. Lenin's analysis, which he wrote during World War I, saw imperialism as this specific phase of capitalism. It was marked by capital developing unevenly and the quick rise of cartels and syndicates, especially by newer industrial powers like Germany and the U.S. Nkrumah builds on this. He explains how monopoly capitalism, always pushing for expansion and control, basically built itself into this international confraternity. Through things like widespread mergers, complex patent agreements, strict production quotas, and fixing prices globally, these really sophisticated tools allowed powerful trusts to carve out their own exclusive territories around the world, systematically crushing competitors and cementing their global power.
And Nkrumah takes this historical analysis even further, making a really provocative claim. He argues that the two huge world wars in the 20th century, 1914-18 and 1939-45, weren't just about big ideas or defending democracy. Instead, he claims they were, in reality, wars fought for the redivision of the world by monopoly capitalism. That's a massive statement. It suggests that underneath all the politics and nationalism, these global conflicts were primarily about reshuffling and consolidating global economic control among the most powerful financial and industrial groups.
Precisely. This redivision, he argues, lets certain trusts grab a wider sphere of exclusive operation and crush their rivals even more. But here's where Nkrumah adds another layer, arguably even more critical, especially when looking at the developed world. He says that in these core capitalist countries, capitalism actually got stronger by strategically giving up two of its old habits. First, the really brutal exploitation of their own working classes. And second, keeping the state strictly out of capitalist business. Instead, these nations developed what we now call welfare states. These systems have relatively high living standards for working people and some level of state-regulated capitalism, social safety nets, public services, that kind of thing.
Okay, so what does this all really mean when we put it together? It means, according to Nkrumah, that the global economic setup we see today isn't just some historical accident. It's the direct result of deliberate actions and strategies designed to keep certain groups and nations, the developed ones, on top. And the idea of a welfare state in the developed world, which is often seen as a great social achievement. Nkrumah links it directly to the massive profits and economic surplus taken from less developed nations. It's like the developed nations could afford to give their own people a decent decent slice of the pie, but the pie itself was baked using ingredients, raw materials, cheap labor, huge markets sourced mainly from elsewhere. This, he argues, effectively exported the internal class conflict within capitalist nations onto the world stage, turning it into this stark global rich-poor divide.
Yeah, this analysis really challenges the standard story about post-war development and foreign aid. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Nkrumah is suggesting that world capitalism managed to delay its own internal crisis, the problems of class struggle, by basically turning it into an international crisis. He gives a stark warning that the ultimate danger shifts from possible civil war inside states to international war provoked ultimately by the misery of the majority of mankind who daily grow poorer and poorer. This perspective really pushes you, the listener, to think critically about who actually benefits from aid programs and to question the common idea that developed nations' prosperity is entirely self-made. He argues that the ability of the developed world to maintain both high living standards and huge military spending is directly tied to getting the maximum return and profit from the parts of the international financial system they control in less developed regions.
This sweeping historical and economic picture leads us straight to the post-war rise of the United States. Nkrumah is very clear. The U.S. came out as the real victor of both world wars. He carefully details how American capitalism, largely untouched by the destruction that hit Europe, gained this explosive momentum. American private foreign investments, he shows, just soared from about $500 million in 1900 to an incredible $19,000 million by 1949. That number absolutely dwarfed the foreign investments of old colonial powers like Britain and France combined. It undeniably laid the foundation for America's rapidly growing global influence.
That era really marks a huge shift, reflecting what Nkrumah calls the fierce questing of the more powerful aggressiveness of American imperialism. Unquote. He highlights that even U.S. government loans another $14 billion by 1949, on top of their private money, weren't primarily about making direct profits for the government itself. Instead, their strategic goal was to enhance the position of United States finance capital. How? By creating markets for surplus American goods and by boosting the profits of private American investors in the countries borrowing the money. This shows a really calculated strategic push to secure access to vital raw materials, expand markets for American products, and ultimately strengthen American finance capital around the world.
And with this booming financial power, America immediately looked towards Africa. Jinga carefully details how programs like Point 4 and funds from the Marshall Plan, supposedly for European recovery, were explicitly used to fund American exploration for resources across Africa. He quotes this revealing announcement from the Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA, back in July 1949. It states pretty plainly that American experts with Marshall Plan aid are probing Africa from the Atlas Mountains to the Cape of Good Hope for agricultural and mineral wealth. This was, he argues, a deliberate strategy to find opportunities for American capital participation in key areas like lead, tin, and zinc mining across French North Africa and the Congo. It effectively paved the way for deeper involvement by all the mining companies and military interests, too.
And this concerted effort directly challenged the established European empires. It underlines the constant competition among the imperialist powers themselves, even while they sometimes put up a united front against socialism. Nkrumah also notes how, after the post-war currency devaluations in Europe, committees of top British, American, and French bankers got together specifically to push U.S. investments into Africa and other former European colonies. These powerful financial alliances, he argues, carefully laid the groundwork for the international consortia that quickly started to fast lay a grip on the continent's riches. He names the big players Rockefeller, Morgan, Barclays, Rothschild, Lazard Frères, their names popping up everywhere, strategically dominating the money and finance sectors of newly independent states. This wasn't random investment. It was a carefully planned financial takeover.
Okay, so now we understand how global finance kind of evolved and repositioned itself. Let's look at how this huge financial power actually translates into specific ways of dominating countries on the ground. Nkrumah makes a really critical point about foreign capital in this neo-colonial setup. He argues it's used mainly for exploitation, not for real, self-sustaining development of the less developed countries. He says, quite bluntly, that investment under neocolonialism increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world. That's a profoundly challenging statement. It goes right against the usual story we hear about foreign aid and investment being inherently good or developmental.
Exactly. And Nkrumah is very careful to clarify what he means here. He emphasizes that the struggle he's describing is not aimed at excluding the capital of the developed world. It's not about shutting them out completely. Rather, he says it's aimed at preventing the financial power of the developed countries being used in such a way as to impoverish the less developed. End quote. He suggests foreign investment can be good, but only if it's invested in accordance with a national plan drawn up by the government of the non-aligned state with its own interests in mind. So the key issue isn't the capital itself, it's who's in control. What are the power dynamics? It's about self-determination and how investment happens.
A really powerful example Nkrumah gives is Liberia's very difficult history with foreign loans, especially with the Firestone Rubber Company. He details how early Liberian loans, way back in 1871 and 1912, saw only a tiny bit of the money actually end up in Liberia's treasury. Most of it just got swallowed up by the banks and creditors involved in arranging the loans. Then, in 1926, Firestone gave Liberia a $5 million loan, but with a hefty 7% interest rate. In return for this loan, Liberia basically had to hand over huge areas of land for rubber planting. Nkrumah presents some truly staggering numbers. While Firestone took out about $160 million worth of rubber from Liberia over just 25 years, Liberia itself only got about $8 million from the whole deal. And get this, he highlights that Firestone's average net profit from all this was 3 times Liberia's entire national revenue during that same period. It's a stark, powerful example of just how skewed these deals could be.
Yeah, that case study really makes you ask, why would developing nations take such obviously bad deals? Nkrumah's analysis gives the tough answer. They are often forced into unviable circumstances, left over directly from colonialism, making them desperate for financial help from the former imperial power. He cites a UN estimate that projected it would take less developed countries an incredible 200 years just to catch up to the GDP per person of industrialized nations, even if they managed a decent 5% annual growth rate. That grim forecast really shows the ongoing systemic drain of resources. It also backs up his argument that aid, far from being a gift, is effectively a revolving credit, often paid out by the neo-colonial power only to circle back to the original source through various hidden mechanisms.
So, you can almost picture it like this. Imagine you're trying to build a house and someone offers you a loan for the materials. Great, right. But then, as part of the deal, they insist you have to buy all the materials from their super expensive store. And the loan has so many hidden fees and strings attached that you end up paying them back way more than you ever got. And your house, it's barely finished, maybe even unsafe. That, essentially, is the aid paradox. Nkrumah is laying bare here. He points out these aid programs often have a specific strategic goal to turn the public, state-owned parts of developing economies into just an appendage of private capital. This actively gets in the way of any attempt at non-capitalist or self-directed development. He highlights that the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, explicitly stated it would normally not be prepared to finance publicly owned industrial and extractive enterprises, with only very rare exceptions.
And the financial figures Nkrumah uses to back this up are truly stark. They demand attention. Between 1956 and 1962, he notes $30 billion in capital was officially exported from developed nations to 56 developing countries. But, he estimates, over that exact same period, a staggering $15 billion was pulled out of these same countries just in interest and profit. He gives an even more detailed example for one year, 1961. While $6 billion in aid supposedly went into these developing nations, an astonishing $11.8 billion was taken out. How? Well, that $11.8 billion broke down into $5 billion in direct profit, $1 billion in interest payments, and a hefty $5.8 billion from what he calls non-equivalent exchange. This idea of non-equivalent exchange is key. It refers to the unfair value exchange in trade, where the raw materials exported by developing countries are systematically priced too low, while the manufactured goods they import from developed nations are often priced too high. This creates this invisible but huge drain of wealth. His conclusion is blunt and deeply disturbing. Aid turns out to be another means of exploitation, a modern method of capital export under a more cosmetic name. This analysis really forces a rethink of the whole idea of aid as charity.
It's a built-in disadvantage, isn't it? You're paid less for what you sell, charged more for what you absolutely need to buy. And if you try to negotiate better prices, the powerful interests just threaten you with synthetic alternatives. It really does sound like a rigged game where the rules are constantly bent to favor the big players. This leads us right into Nkrumah's sharp discussion of how these powers maintain total control over world markets and resources. He argues that foreign capital holds immense, almost dictatorial power over global markets and, crucially, the prices of raw materials.
Indeed. Nkrumah presents compelling damning data to show what he calls this big squeeze on developing nations. From 1951 to 1961, he carefully notes that if you exclude oil, The general price level for primary products, the very foundation of many developing economies, dropped by an alarming 33.1%. But during that exact same decade, the prices of manufactured goods, which these developing nations mainly import, went up by 3.5%. And essential machinery and equipment, prices for those soared by an even more dramatic 31.3%. This huge imbalance, he calculates, cost countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America an estimated $41.4 billion in lost income. This means that even when the amount of stuff these countries exported often went up, the actual money they earned from those exports tragically went down, creating a constant deficit.
He illustrates this powerfully with Ghana's own situation in 1962. Nkrumah notes that the value of Ghana's exports that year was exactly the same as in 1961, even though the actual volume of goods shipped out increased by 6%. On the flip side, the total value of Ghana's imports fell by 16%, but the actual volume of goods imported only went down by 14%. So Ghana was effectively getting less money for selling more stuff, while at the same time paying more money for buying less stuff. It's a clear, real-world example of the big squeeze that Africa and many developing regions were trapped in, selling raw materials cheap while being forced to buy finished goods and services at inflated prices.
This reality just highlights the deep structural disadvantage these countries face. Nkrumah points out that Africa, despite everything, holds an amazing 53 of the world's most important basic industrial minerals and metals. For instance, it has 19% of the world's tin ore, a huge 80% of manganese, 47% of bauxite, and an overwhelming 82% of cobalt. Yet, he laments, in none of the new African countries is there a single integrated industry based upon any one of these resources. Instead, these incredibly valuable minerals are overwhelmingly shipped out raw, unprocessed, just to feed the industries and plants of Europe, America, and Japan. He gives specific examples. Manganese ore from Gabon going straight to the US and France, iron ore from Swaziland heading for Japanese steel mills. The cruel irony, he emphasizes, is that when these same countries later have to buy back their own minerals as finished goods, maybe steel girders or electronic parts, they have to pay grossly inflated prices, completing this cycle of exploitation.
And it's not just about the raw materials leaving cheaply. Nkrumah also describes how these big companies actively play with supply to keep prices where they want them. He notes, for example, that for 3 years leading up to mid-1964, the big copper companies were running production at between 80 and 85% of capacity just to keep up prices. Similarly, steel production was deliberately kept down to about 80% capacity. This artificial creation of scarcity, deliberately limiting supply, gives these monopolies huge power over the countries producing the raw materials. It lets them dictate terms and guarantee high profits for themselves.
And on top of that, a particularly nasty threat used by these powers is the strategic deployment of synthetic alternatives. Nkrumah points out that the very companies producing natural products are often also major producers of artificial versions. This gives them a powerful weapon. The threat to just switch to synthetics if the primary producers ask for better prices. For instance, synthetic diamond factories were set up not just by GE in the US, but also by De Beers, the company that dominates the natural diamond market globally. The same pattern holds for rubber. Giants like Firestone, Goodrich, and Goodyear, who control huge natural rubber plantations, are also heavily invested in making synthetic rubber. This double control gives them absolute leverage. It lets them dictate terms to the primary producing countries, making sure prices for natural resources stay low and don't challenge their bottom line. This reinforces Nkrumah's broader point that understanding these complex economic games is the first, most vital step towards challenging them. That quote from the chairman of Bolsa, admitting that rising commodity prices mainly benefit reserve currencies, sterling and the dollar, is almost a shockingly direct confession of this built-in financial bias.
This is really where the full impact of Nkrumah's analysis starts to hit home. When you begin connecting these seemingly separate dots, you realize these aren't just individual companies or banks acting alone. They're intricately connected networks, almost like a global shadow state. It's not just about one powerful company's influence, but about this entire vast web of control that stretches across the global economy. So what does this all mean for someone like you, the listener, just trying to understand the deeper forces shaping our world? Nkrumah paints this stark picture of an empire of finance capital, a vast, sprawling network of intercontinental activity, controlling the lives of millions all over the planet. He constantly stresses just how interconnected these huge financial interests are.
Right, this serpentine interlocking of financial monopoly, as Nkrumah calls it, is a really critical insight. He names prominent families and institutions whose influence is ubiquitous in global finance and industry. People like Oppenheimer, Hambro, Rothschild, Morgan, Rockefeller, Lazard, Frere, Schroeder. These names keep appearing across different sectors, mining, banking, manufacturing, and across multiple continents. It starkly shows just how pervasive and deeply rooted their influence is.
He then carefully explains a key way this control is maintained through the widespread use of holding companies and interlocking directorates. These complex structures, he shows, allow a relatively small capital investment to control vast sums in subsidiary and interlocked enterprises. He gives the compelling example of the Big Five British banks. Back in 1951, there were 147 directors, collectively held over 1,000 directorships, and almost 300 of those were in other financial institutions. He quotes Sam Aronovich, who wrote that the more the interlocking takes place, the less one can say, this one is a financier and that one is an industrialist. There emerges a group of finance capitalists dominating both finance and industry. This really blurs the lines and reveals a kind of unified power structure.
Yeah, and this further backs up Nkrumah's argument that national policies often end up being driven by the overriding interests of these powerful monopoly groups. Their representatives frequently get placed in key positions within governments and international organizations. Nkrumah offers a particularly detailed and eye-opening case study, the Oppenheimer Empire. He describes Harry Frederick Oppenheimer as the king of mining in South Africa, indeed in Africa, even the emperor, with an ever-extending empire. Okay. He explains that over half of all foreign capital invested in Africa went into South Africa. British investments were nearly $2.8 billion, American investments closer to $840 million. A 1957 U.S. government survey, Nkrumah points out, starkly showed that mining and smelting in South Africa was the single most profitable area for American overseas investment. It yielded much higher profits than similar investments back in the United States itself.
And the main reason for these massive super profits, it's shockingly clear and absolutely central to Nkrumah's argument. He highlights that the high profits can be explained largely by the cheapness of African labor. He presents this stark, almost unbelievable comparison. The average hourly wage for U.S. miners was $2.70. South African miners, often working in terrible conditions, earned less than 10 cents an hour. That's a difference of 27 times. This direct, undeniable link between exploitative labor and huge profits is a core part of his whole analysis. He gives another example. Consolidated Goldfields invested $450 million in South African gold mines after WWII and made huge profits. But then Kanongo gold mines in Ghana, which used to be profitable, was suddenly sold to the Ghanaian government for just £150,000 because it supposedly became uneconomic for the foreign company, even though it was a fully working mine that the Ghanaian government then managed to operate successfully.
The Oppenheimer Empire, through its main companies like Anglo-American Corporation and Rand Selection Corporation, controls vast interests in gold, diamonds, platinum, and tons of other vital minerals across South Africa, Rhodesia, and the Congo. Nkrumah carefully details the complex links between this empire and other global giants, ICI, DuPont, Union Miniere, Tanganyika Concessions, Morgan, Rockefeller. This huge, intricate network, Nkrumah argues, makes it crystal clear that these aren't just separate companies acting alone. Instead, they form an international chain of common interest that regards the likely coming together of the new nations as a major blow at its continued domination of the resources and economies of others. This powerfully reinforces his main point. These sophisticated systems are designed specifically to maintain outside control and maximize the extraction of wealth from the developing world.
Wow. Okay, so it's chilling, isn't it, to think about how deep these ideological and cultural tools can go. I mean, from the movies you watch, the news stories you read, even things that look like innocent aid programs or cultural exchanges. According to Nkrumah, they can all be part of a much bigger, more subtle strategy to shape thinking and keep control. It really shows the incredible scope and sophistication of neo-colonial methods. Nkrumah is emphatic. Neo-colonialists do not confine their operations to the economic sphere. Instead, he says, they use the old colonialist methods of religious, educational, and cultural infiltration, but with new, modern tools. It's truly a full-spectrum approach to keeping influence, and it often happens way under the radar.
Yeah, this part of Nkrumah's analysis raises a really crucial question for you, the listener, today. How do we critically navigate all these subtle, pervasive influences? Nkrumah strongly pushes for relentless critical thinking and analysis. He stresses that understanding the economic influences and pressures that stand behind the political events is absolutely key to really getting what goes on in the world today. He points directly to what he, quoting others, calls an invisible government, this massive hidden apparatus of intelligence networks like the CIA. Even back in the 1960s, he estimated it employed around 200,000 people and spent billions. Their main goal, he states, is precisely to achieve colonialism in fact while preaching independence.
He gives some pretty chilling examples of this political infiltration and the instability it can cause. He mentions Algeria in April 1961, Vietnam, Korea, Suez, Cuba, all as examples where imperialist nations went to extreme lengths, often using covert action or direct intervention to keep or regain control. He highlights how an anti-communism ideology was often used as the main justification for these actions, framing them as these huge struggles to bring the socialist sector of the globe back into the exploitative control of Western financial monopoly. So yeah, it's not just about money and markets, it's profoundly about controlling minds and stories, both within the targeted countries and internationally.
And beyond the obvious political meddling and spy agencies, Nkrumah carefully exposes the extensive cultural and ideological warfare being used. He describes this riptide of religious sects, mostly American, that seemed to spread dramatically after liberation movements gained ground. He specifically mentions the Jehovah's Witnesses, who in some developing countries taught people not to salute their own national flags. This, he suggests, was a deliberate effort to smother the outcry against neo-colonial activities by channeling nationalistic energy into apolitical spiritual matters. It shows how even seemingly harmless spiritual movements can be, perhaps unintentionally or maybe deliberately, used or leveraged in a larger strategic game.
And this influence reaches deep into schools too, subtly shaping the next generation. Nkrumah claims that many expatriate teachers and cultural ambassadors actively influence the minds of the young against their own country and people. How? By undermining confidence in the national government and social system through exalting their own notions of how a state should be run, often ignoring the basic point that there's no monopoly of political wisdom, right? It's a subtle, almost invisible kind of ideological conditioning, though he notes, maybe ironically, that students, perhaps because they are exposed to different ideas and critical thinking, are often in the vanguard of the fight against neo-colonialism, suggesting their education can sometimes actually equip them to resist these very influences.
Media and propaganda are identified as equally vital and powerful tools in this ideological fight. Nkrumah warns that even the cinema stories of fabulous Hollywood are loaded. He observes, with a kind of wry insight, how African audiences would sometimes cheer as Hollywood's heroes slaughter red Indians or Asiatics, suggesting just how effective this cultural propaganda can be, even for people who can't read, because the visual stories carry powerful, unspoken messages. He argues that films deliver an incessant barrage of anti-socialist propaganda, in which the trade union man, the revolutionary, or the man of dark skin is generally cast as the villain, while the policeman, the catalyst entrepreneur, or the CIA-type spy is ever the hero.
And then there's the news itself, the daily information source for millions. Nkrumah carefully details how the enormous monopoly press and glossy magazines, often distributed globally, control and shape the stories we hear. He argues that one or two news agencies controlled the news handouts, which leads to this deadly uniformity in reporting across huge parts of the world. Internationally, he points to the massive financial weight of the United States, which, through its huge network of foreign correspondents and its pervasive influence over global capitalist media, floods the world with what he calls anti-liberation propaganda. This propaganda, he notes, often defaults to calling nationalists and freedom fighters rebels, terrorists, or frequently communist terrorists, a clear attempt to make their struggles look illegitimate in the eyes of the world.
The United States Information Agency, or USIA, is singled out by Nkrumah as a key player in this massive U.S. psychological warfare effort. He provides some striking numbers to show its reach: 12,000 staff, a budget over $130 million a year, 110 radio stations, 60 outside the U.S., 120 branches in 100 countries, with 50 strategically placed in Africa alone. The USIA, he states, actively broadcasts 30 different radio programs within Africa that specifically glorify the U.S. while simultaneously discrediting independent African countries and non-aligned movements. Its explicit goal, according to Nkrumah, was to prevent expansion of national media in order to capture the marketplace of ideas, basically ensuring a U.S. absolute monopoly in the field of propaganda. He gives a particularly stark example. Both Togo and Congo, Leopoldville, were apparently threatened with having their aid cut off if they dared let Russian information centers operate in their countries. This effectively forced them to back down. Unbiased studies, he notes, have pointed out the alarmingly close links between the USIA and U.S. intelligence agencies.
Beyond government agencies, Nkrumah also looks into organizations like Moral Rearmament, MRA, and the Peace Corps, analyzing their roles. He describes MRA, founded by American Frank Buchman, as a fascist organization that remarkably advocated the appeasement of Hitler before World War II. Later, Nkrumah claims, it promoted a philosophy of collaboration between the forces oppressing the African peoples and those same peoples, basically telling Africans to just reconcile with their exploiters. He points out that key figures like Maurice Stromae and Joseph Kasavubu, controversial leaders in post-independence Congo, were MRA supporters. Some newspapers even claimed MRA got money from the CIA.
When MRA's direct influence started to fade, Nkrumah argues, the American Peace Corps was strategically set up in 1961 by President Kennedy. Sergeant Shriver Jr., who had significant ties to former CIA head Allen Dulles, was put in charge. Nkrumah presents the Peace Corps not just as a humanitarian effort, but as part of a huge ideological plan for invading the so-called Third World. This involved a systematic, though subtle, use of U.S. citizens abroad for virtual intelligence activities and propaganda work. He even mentions a proposal for a businessmen corps, which, like the Peace Corps, would supposedly use big business for espionage, hinting at an even deeper merging of intelligence gathering with economic and commercial activities. This whole section really raises a critical question for you, the listener. In today's world overflowing with information, how do you critically consume news and culture? Nkrumah's sharp analysis encourages us to look beyond the surface, to rigorously question where our information comes from, and to be aware of potential hidden agendas. It powerfully highlights that the fight for real independence is also a deep struggle for intellectual and cultural self-determination.
Okay, so despite all this complex power, all the sophistication of these neo-colonial methods, Nkrumah sees a fundamental weakness, a critical vulnerability right at the heart of it all. He argues quite definitively that neocolonialism is not a sign of imperialism's strength, but rather of its last hideous gasp. He sees it as proof of imperialism's inability to rule any longer by old methods. It's almost like he pictures this giant that's tripped and is now desperately scrambling to keep its balance, trying to hold on through these new, less direct tactics. And for Nkrumah, the ultimate key to defeating it lies in understanding and then directly fighting back against that age-old imperial strategy of divide and rule.
Right. This specific point offers a really crucial shift in perspective for you, the listener. Instead of seeing the developing world as inherently weak or just perpetual victims, Nkrumah powerfully reframes it as a place of immense potential strength if certain critical conditions are met. He shows how history furnishes innumerable proofs that the budding future is always stronger than the withering past, suggesting that popular will and collective action can overcome what seem like impossible odds. He powerfully points to successful revolutions like the American Revolution in 1776 and the Russian and Chinese revolutions, all of which won against huge established powers. He also highlights the ongoing struggle in South Vietnam at the time, where despite overwhelming foreign military power and sophisticated special warfare tactics, the people of both North and South Vietnam are proving to be unconquerable. For Nkrumah, this is undeniable proof that neocolonialism, despite its insidious power, can and will be defeated.
This inherent weakness within neocolonialism and these historical examples of overcoming imperial forces lead straight to Nkrumah's big, compelling vision: African unity. He argues passionately that Africa, when he was writing, was fragmented into too many small, uneconomic, and non-viable states. Cool. This deliberate fragmentation, he argues, makes individual nations easy targets for neocolonial forces. They simply can't bargain effectively with powerful foreign companies on their own. He draws a clear contrast. Ghana had a relatively stronger position when negotiating with aluminium companies because of its larger economy and growing industry. Compare that to Togo's much weaker position when dealing with powerful French phosphate interests. The small, isolated state just doesn't have the leverage.
Nkrumah stresses that the modern trend everywhere in the world, driven by economic reality, is undeniably towards larger economic and political units. Therefore, he passionately calls for continentally planned economic growth across Africa. He envisions not just industrial development, but a coordinated, unified approach to agriculture, fishing, and forestry, too. The benefits, he argues, would be huge and transformative. Pooling vast resources, efficiently coordinating development projects across the continent, dramatically raising living standards for all Africans, and critically, creating a home market big enough to actually support genuine, large-scale industrialization without depending on outsiders. He emphasizes the urgent need to act now, before each state gets too deeply involved in major investment and structural decisions based on narrow national markets. He warns that with each month that passes, the foreign interests of neocolonialism get a tighter grip on Africa's economic life, making future unification efforts even harder.
And this isn't just about economic cooperation or, a common market. Nkrumah insists absolutely strongly that economic unity to be effective must be accompanied by political unity. The two are inseparable, each necessary for the future greatness of our continent and the full development of our resources. So He clearly sees the political fragmentation of Africa at the time not as an accident, but as a deliberate strategic goal of neo-colonialism, carefully designed to maintain control and prevent a truly powerful, self-determining African entity from emerging.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger global picture, Nkrumah suggests that if faced with a truly united Africa, the neo-colonialists would eventually have no choice but to adjust themselves to this new balance of world forces, just like capitalism has had to adapt to other major shifts in power throughout history. He argues that the only truly effective way to challenge the enormous capitalist monopoly that's so deeply rooted in Africa and to genuinely recover possession of our heritage is to act on a Pan-African basis through a union government. This compelling vision is all about achieving profound self-determination through collective strength. It's a strategy that would fundamentally change the global power balance and potentially force a major reshuffling of international relations. This raises an important question for you to think about. What specific internal weaknesses or inherent internal conflicts within neocolonialism itself make Nkrumah so absolutely certain that it cannot endure as a permanent world policy? His vision isn't just a hope, he sees it as a strategic necessity.
So, as we bring this deep dive into Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, to a close, let's just quickly recap the really powerful and, I think, lasting insights he offers. We've explored how he defines neo-colonialism as the system where nations, technically independent, are subtly controlled from the outside, often through complex economic, financial, and sometimes even military means. We've peeled back the layers on its insidious methods from rigged trade deals and manipulated commodity prices to the illusion of foreign aid that actually works more like modern capital extraction. And we've journeyed through that intricate web of financial empire, seeing how powerful, interconnected interests hold vast control over global resources and economies. And Nkrumah's analysis fundamentally argues that foreign capital within this system is used for exploitation, not for fostering genuine self-reliant development in less developed countries.
Exactly. And understanding Nkrumah's sharp arguments is, I think, more crucial than ever for making sense of our complex world today. His insights really equip you to critically analyze global events, to pick apart economic news, and even to deconstruct cultural things that might seem unrelated at first glance. He urges us to look behind the headlines in the financial pages of the world's newspapers, saying they actually give the news behind the news. This deep dive, we really hope, has empowered you to see the deeper, often hidden forces at play, to question the dominant stories, and to recognize the subtle but profound ways power is still wielded globally.
Nkrumah argued that the real threat to world peace doesn't come from those trying to end neocolonialism and achieve real independence. It comes from the inaction of those who let it continue, those who benefit from it. So, as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this. What role could a deeper understanding of these historical and ongoing dynamics play in actually shaping a more equitable, a more just future? Not just for Africa, but for the whole world. How might this deeper knowledge change how you engage with global issues and the information you encounter every day? We hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about and maybe sparked your own further exploration.